Thank you, Mindy. Hello again. The story I'm going to share with you is written and told by a storyteller, the late Jeffrey Lewis, and before his passing gave me permission to tell his stories. This is a first tell of this story for me of his, and it's called Ice. I never hated a place so much in my life. I had to get out before I succumbed to it. The Antarctic was no place to be lost, and we were lost. We were all in one large tent, half buried in the snow, surrounded by a sea of frozen ice and snow. The temperature was 60 degrees below zero outside, and the little stove inside warmed things up to about 10 below. We lay in our bags most of the time to keep warm. And we remembered our 4 friends who had disappeared into a crevasse a few days before, along with all of our navigational equipment, all but one of the dogs. We were all pretty weak from the constant exposure to the sub-zero temperatures and the rapture of being in a freezing, white, empty space. Someone had to go and try to find the way to the rendezvous with the ship. It was then that I said I knew which way the bay was and I would leave immediately. But I didn't have a clue. I took a small amount of food, a sleeping bag, and some extra mittens. I wrote down our coordinates, and then I called the Bushman, the last of the Huskies. We started to step out, and then one of my friends, who could no longer speak, handed me a torn piece of paper. On it were written the words, "When you come back, we will be here." I stood for a moment, and I looked from face to face. In their eyes I saw trust, but no hope. Then I turned, and Bushman and I stepped out into the blistering cold. The Antarctic was in its 6 months of dim light. The sun sat on the horizon like as cold and bright as a star in space. The sky was low and gray, and the light flat. A steady wind had kicked up and was swirling the snow around my knees. The land was flat and straight as far as you could see in every direction but one. There, far off, I could see the tips of ice spires barely jutting up over the horizon. I covered my face from the freezing cold, and I started jogging toward them. Bushman loped in front of me at a steady distance, like he was leading his pack. After about a mile, I looked back. The tent, it had dissolved into the landscape, and I was glad to be moving away from that place. We kept up a steady lope to keep warm, covered ground. The landscape didn't change as I moved through it, and I felt like I was running through eternity. And for a moment, I lost hope. We traveled many hours over the snow and ice through the wind. And then at last, right in front of me were the ice spires, rising up out of the ground like a forest of giant icicles. I was near exhaustion, so I found a place out of the wind and leaned up against one of the spires. I unrolled my bag and I climbed in. I invited Bushman in, but instead he dug a hole in the snow and crawled into it. I threw him a piece of jerky. I had some too, and then I tried to sleep, listening to the screeching of the wind and the tops of the spires. All of a sudden I was awakened by a sharp crack. I looked up just in time to see a top of one of the spires break off of the brittle air and come crashing down right nearby. This was not a safe place to be, and I thought, if only I could reach out to the other side of this ice field. Now, Bushman was sitting there looking at me. I had no other plan than to try to get out to the other side. And he sat there looking at me, and I rolled up my bag, tied it to my back, and I started snaking my way through the ice forest. Mostly I followed Bushman. He seemed to know where he was going, but he quickly disappeared. It was hard to keep moving in one direction because I had to keep weaving through the ice field. As I moved along, I started to drift in my mind. I thought about my friends back there in the tent. At least they were a little warmer, had some food. I thought of their trust in me, how they were depending on me to reach the ship and tell it to wait, come back and lead them out. I thought of the ship and of all of us on it, sailing away from this lonely, desolate place, of putting in on an island, a tropical island somewhere north of here, swimming in the warm turquoise waters, lying on the beach, eating fruit in the warm sun. The warm sun. I pictured it so clearly that for a moment I was there. And I thought, this world is really quite small if you don't have to move through it in a body. Suddenly I stopped and looked down. There at my feet was a chasm, a rip, a slit in the earth that disappeared down deep into blackness. I had drifted off and nearly fallen into it. I looked around to reorient myself. The ice spires rose up all around me. The crevasse dropped below, and the razor wind swirled through the canyons of ice. Just then, a piece of the sun, far off on the horizon, it peeked through the clouds, and a beam of light caught the top of a spire nearest me. It reflected onto another spire, and then onto another, and another, until all around me, shafts of light were shooting through and through the ice spires, a random network of laser beams that hypnotized me with their sudden brilliance. And just as quickly they were gone, and I was too confused to move. I heard barking and looked up and saw Bushman there on the other side of the crevasse. He was looking directly at me. I snapped out of my trance. He went back a few steps and then came back again, looking at me. He seemed to know where he wanted to go, and he definitely wanted me on the other side of that chasm. I walked back several yards, then turned and ran and leaped into the air. I landed hard on the opposite rim, right on my chest. For an instant, I had no breath, and I began to slip. I didn't know what to do. I reached up and I caught the edge just in time to keep myself dropping out of sight forever. But I couldn't pull myself up. I kicked my foot into the side of the crevasse to try to get a toehold, but it was too hard. I couldn't hang on any longer. My frozen fingers were cramping up, and I began slipping off. Suddenly, I felt something grab the top of my hood. There was a rip as Bushman's teeth cut through the material, and then he began to pull. My face scraped along the ice as he dragged me upward. I could hear him growling deep in his throat. For an instant, I was hanging from those powerful jaws. And then I gripped an outcropping of ice, and a second later I was lying on the other side of that crevasse. Bushman sat there in front of me, panting. For a moment, we looked at each other. And then I said, "Thank you, Bushman." He wagged his tail and then turned and loped away. I jumped up and started following him through the maze of ice spires again. I struggled along after him, stumbling over the rough terrain, sometimes crawling on my hands and knees. My face was frozen stiff. My fingers and toes were numb. After what seemed like days of constant walking through the pale light, I stepped out of the forest of ice spires onto a long, flat plain, white, stretching forever into the bitter cold. It seemed like I was right back where I started. Just then, the howling wind brought with it the throbbing sound of a ship's foghorn, and I knew I had made it out to the other side. I began jogging toward the sound. In a few minutes, I could see tiny lights up ahead. I ran faster, and I was filled with a feeling of triumph. But then I stopped. Bushman, where was it? I looked around. The frozen landscape was empty in every direction. I called as loud as I could. There was a storm approaching, and the ship sounded its horn once more. I said a silent goodbye to my furry friend, ran toward the ship, the tears freezing on my face. By the time I reached it, I was exhausted. They hoisted me up and took me to the officers' quarters. It was warm and cozy there, and I told them my story. The captain was silent for a few seconds and then apologized and said they couldn't send a party back at this time. They were getting up steam to sail out to sea, where they would ride out the storm that was approaching. They said that they would be back in a couple of weeks, and I must stay with them on board to guide them back here when the time came. They said it would be suicide to stay in the storm. I agreed, but I thought of my friends somewhere out there on the ice. I was afraid they would die out there without hope. I bundled up and went back out on deck. I stood on the fantail, looking off at the lowering clouds and the razor-cold winds. The ice was closing in around the ship. And then I heard a noise and looked down. There was Bushman, standing on the ice, looking up at me. He barked again. This great, furry dog had saved my life, and I knew in an instant what I must do. I went below and got a compass. I wrote down the ship's coordinates and left a note on the captain's bunk. Back on deck, I tied off a line and slid down to the ice. I hugged Bushman, and together we disappeared back into the storm. Later, the captain would read the note. It had been written on a torn piece of paper in a shaking hand, and it said, "When you come back, we will be here."